else stops. We have a couple of issues that are major issues, but not to really large numbers of people. But they're issues that are meaningful, very meaningful to a few. And it happens that there's been progress in both of these. Now, one of them is an issue that has to do with Western Sahara. And I know that a lot of people are not really familiar with that or what the issue is, but it's an old issue. It's been around since 1966. It's a very significant issue where it's one that you've heard me talk about for quite some time, but we've made some great progress. First of all, it bears repeating because they're called the Sahrawis. The Sahrawis are the people from Western Sahara. They're kind of a voiceless people, and that's why I'm here, because nobody else is here on that. So how we got here, as West Africa was being decolonized, Western Sahara was clear and declared an independent nation, despite Morocco attempting to claim it as a territory. In 1966, the UN General Assembly resolution agreed that the referendum of self-determination should be held. That's the UN General Assembly. There was no disagreement at that time except from Morocco. And everyone was in agreement. In fact, at that time, Morocco was even in agreement. This is 1966. And we're going to have a determination is in the form of a referendum that would be taking place in 1975. So it was 1966, planning for 1975. Self-determination is just merely letting the Sahrawi people decide for themselves the imperative principle of action, the right to judge for themselves to be independent or to be a part of Morocco. Now, this is just the first promise of a referendum. To date, none has been kept. The International Court of Justice opinion from 1975 also agreed that Morocco did not have any sovereignty over the land and that the referendum of self-determination should be held. So you have the International Court of Justice, do you agree with this? The United Nations General Assembly, all in agreement. Morocco maintained its unlawful claim to Western Sahara, and after decolonization, attempted to annex the country with force. Western Sahara officially, the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republican through the Polisario defended their rights to the land. And after more than a decade of violence from Morocco, the United Nations finally intervened in 1991, and both sides agreed to a ceasefire and a path forward. That was 1991. It was called at that time the settlement plan. It solidified that Morocco and Western Sahara agreed to hold a referendum and a date of that referendum, and created a United Nations mission to a referendum to solidify it. So those were keeping, if you're keeping track, that was the third promise, and it's worth noting the UN regularly reaffirms the 1991 commitment to a referendum for self-determination. Now, self-determination is something that people assume there's not opposition to. Self-determination is something that's very meaningful to us in our history in this country, and this is something that at that time was accepted. I can remember talking several times with previous administrations, going back to the Reagan administration, and people were at that time knowing that this was going to happen, but just didn't know for sure how it was going to happen or when it was going to happen. And here it is now, decades later, and it hasn't happened yet. The referendum for 1992 never took place, and the process stalled. Through the ceasefire that was held, Morocco just wouldn't hold up to its end of the bargain. Former Secretary of State James Baker, I remember when this administration, the previous administration came in, James Baker had read someplace that I was concerned about this issue, this old issue that had never been resolved, and he called me up and he said, well, I want you to know that I spent a lot of years with three different presidents trying to get this done, and we were unable to do it, but let me work with you. So this is an issue that one of these rare things where everyone agrees, but they don't come out. So anyway, they had a special envoy to the Western Sahara. Baker worked in multiple Plans with Morocco and Western Sahara came close many times, but it never happened. So, most notable, the Houston Agreement was signed by Morocco and Western Sahara and recommitted to a referendum of self-determination planned for 1998. That would have been the fourth time. Morocco recognized they would likely lose a vote quickly, tanked all negotiations, and the next year, by declaration, they would never accept a referendum that included independence as an outcome, despite years of promise otherwise. The conflict stalled then, leaving us in what is called a frozen conflict for more than 2 decades. In the end of last year, in November to be precise, Morocco tried to violently crush a peaceful protest in the Gujarat area. The Western Saharans were peacefully protesting Morocco's direct violation of the United Nations ceasefire agreement by using the road in this direction. So, but the international community did nothing. Then truly the worst thing that happened, there was a change in policy of the United States that had been a policy for some 3 decades, where they actually were recognizing Morocco's sovereignty. Now that decision was wrong and reversed decades of the United States policy, but the policy held until 1966. It was a shocking announcement and deeply disturbing to all who valued the individual rights for self-determination. And that's why earlier this year, Senator Leahy and I led 25 of our colleagues in a bipartisan letter to President Biden urging him to reverse the harmful policy and to recommit to a policy of self-determination. And this is something that I know that he recognizes. I actually personally talked to him about this in his first week in office. It hasn't been done yet, and it should be done, and many of our colleagues and I are not alone in our push for Western Sahara to have the right for self-determination, and so does the African Union, which comprised 55 member states. We have most of the European community who support the UN efforts on our side. The European Court of Justice also ruled that the Western Sahara is not a part of Morocco, and the EU, the economic agreements can cover Western Sahara. So anyway, this has happened over and over again for a long period of time, and just fairly recently, the Sultana Haya had a CNN, and I'm actually going to wind up with this, with an agreement with my friend from Maryland. But, and that is the statement that she made. She said, and this is a quote, "Morocco's repression of Sahrawi people and the Sahrawi human rights defenders in particular is well documented. The Sahrawis have struggled under Moroccan occupation since 1975, and this repression will continue until occupation is ended. And while the United Nations Security Council supports giving the people of Western Sahara the chance to determine their own future through a referendum, Morocco has refused to allow the referendum to take place, depriving us of the chance for self-determination." So she concluded by saying that I cannot find the words to describe the endless suffering that I personally and the Sahrawi people more generally have endured under this violent occupation. They are resolute, and we should be too. Now with this, I would like to offer my friend, since he has been waiting for a long period of time, to use the remainder of my time, if he will then yield the floor to me at the conclusion of his.
Madam President.
Senator from Maryland.
I thank my friend from Oklahoma. The two of us arrived in the House of Representatives on the same day. We've been friends for all this period of time, and I thank him for his generosity. Madam President, I take this time to talk about legislation we'll be considering tomorrow, which will be the budget resolution. It gives us a once-in-a-generation opportunity. And I'd just like to pause for a moment because it's part of President Biden's Build Back